Hi, I'm Brittany, a neurodivergent mum and speech pathologist. This is Not Just Theories, where I share what actually works in my real, messy life. Because life doesn't follow a theory. Here's what I actually do. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Not Just Theories. This is our third and final episode of the little mini-series we're doing at the moment on robust vocabulary instruction. In episode 1, we talked about what robust vocabulary actually is and how I work on it in a clinic setting. In episode 2, we moved into the home, looking at how we can highlight words naturally while reading books with our children. Today, we're going to take it one step further, so out of the book and into play. We'll talk about how to model and define vocabulary while playing with your child in a way that's natural, fun, and respectful of their play. If you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes yet, now is a great time to hit pause and go back and listen to them first. That theory will come in really handy while we're talking. If you haven't listened to it and you don't have time to go back and you want to listen to today and just get straight into play, you can. But I do really recommend going back and listening to those when you get a chance, because I think understanding the underlying theory will just make all of this make a lot more sense. So why do we talk about doing this in play? Well, play is a child's work. It's where kids are the most themselves. And it's the place where kids are meant to experiment, they're meant to imagine, and they're meant to practice their problem-solving skills. It's also where language flows most freely, and it is the perfect place to weave in some rich vocabulary. But, and this is really important, just like with the book reading, the goal is not to turn playtime into a mini lesson. So this is not about drilling, it's not about testing. It's about joining your child where they are and sprinkling in the words here and there just to increase the amount of meaningful exposures. Sometimes I might set up what's called an invitation to play. For example, if last night we read a book with the word pour in it, the next morning I might set out a little tea set with a jug of water. It's giving me a natural chance to model that word pouring while we play. But this is not forced. If my child doesn't want to play with the tea set, it's okay. I don't insist on it. Still stay open to what they do want to play. And then look for opportunities within that. They might decide that their doll wants to have a bath, and then maybe there's a chance for me to talk about pouring involved in that. The key is to still follow your child's lead. When you're thinking about these invitations to play, it can be really fun to make it really complicated. But I find that sometimes the more work you put in, the more likely you are to try and force your child to play with that. I know on Instagram I've seen some absolutely beautiful play setups where I think, wow, that parent has put in so much time and they've, done all this sensory base and it's all themed and beautiful. And some parents love doing that, and that's a fun thing for them. I'm no disrespect to that. If that's something you enjoy doing, feel free to go ahead and do it. But if you're then going to get upset because your child's not playing with it or not playing it the way you thought they would, then maybe hold off. If you're doing that for your own joy and benefit, please continue. But I know that I've put in a lot of time before to do a themed sensory play kit for my daughter, and then she had absolutely no interest. And it was actually really disappointing for me. And I realized I was making her play about myself. So when I say set up an invitation to play, really we're talking something that's quick and easy put together, and if your child completely ignores it, you're not going to sit there going, why did I waste my time? So something you can put together in less than 2 minutes. Oh, I'm going to pull out some plastic cups out of our regular cupboard and I'm going to pour some water into a cup that we usually use. So you're not going to any extra effort, you're not buying any special toys, you're just with things you have readily available to you, putting them available to your child. And then following their lead if they're not interested. Something else I try really consciously to avoid when I'm doing this is slipping into what I call the narrator role. So you know the one, you've probably seen it at the park. It's where the adult is just walking around or sitting next to the child and describing everything the child is doing. Oh, you're pouring the tea, you're stirring the cup, you're giving me a biscuit. Or if you're at the park, you might say, oh, you're sliding down the slide, oh, you're swinging on the swing. And that kind of narration, while it's reasonably good for increasing a child's comprehension of words, it can lead to a situation where the child thinks, okay, my role is to play and be quiet, and it's my parents' job to talk about what I do. That's if they're even listening. So instead of doing that narration, what I try to do is join into the play. So grabbing my own toy or taking turns with my child. If my child's pouring the tea with a teapot, I might take the milk jug. So instead of saying you're pouring the tea, I might say I'm pouring the milk while I'm pretending to pour. So that way my child is seeing that play and talk can happen together. And it's modeling something that they could do the next time they poured, rather than sort of reinforcing, oh, I sit here and I do things and my parents' job is the job to talk. I hope that makes sense. So let's go back to the word pour. My child pours a cup of tea, then I pour my own and I say, I'm pouring the tea. So notice I'm trying to use the target word while I'm actually doing the action. So as much as possible, trying to match the words to what your child is seeing or hearing in that moment. When we're thinking about using those tier 2 words in that moment, like in the last 2 sessions, trying to naturally add in a child-friendly definition. So just like we said in the book reading, pour means letting the water come out of the jug. But you don't do this every time because it can be a little bit too much. And I definitely do not stop play to deliver a mini lecture. The other crucial point, just like with the book reading, is that I am not asking my child to repeat it back. I don't say, can you say pour? It makes the moment feel like a test when you do that. So instead, I'm trusting that if they hear it enough, in enough meaningful ways, it will eventually become part of their own vocabulary. With so much of teaching your child language, it is actually about controlling what's in your power to control. And it's actually not the job of the parent to control what the child says. Our job is to create a rich, language-full environment, to trust that the child will say the word on their own when they're ready, if that's on the path for that child. And it's not a moral failure if your child is not using these words, and it is not our job to make a child talk. Our job as parents is to create an environment where if your child is at the stage where they can talk and might talk, then they will. And that's that trust. I think there's a lot of people out there who hear about research like, the 1 million word gap, and they think it's on them to make their child speak. And a lot of parental guilt is created when parents think it's their job to teach their child to talk. And if their child's not talking, that's their fault. And that's just so often not the case. As long as you have set up an environment where your child is exposed to meaningful, rich language, your job is done. And if your child's not learning language at the rate you might expect them to when you've done those things, that's when it's important to go and see a speech pathologist and find out, is there a barrier that's getting in between your child learning those words? So does your child have fluid in their ears, and do they need something like grommets or ear tube surgery to be able to learn? Is there, some sort of underlying cognitive delay that might be getting in the way, that your child could benefit from extra support? Is your child non-speaking, and would they benefit from a dedicated alternative communication device to help them communicate? So there's lots of things that could be going on, and almost none of them should have a parent feeling guilty. Sorry, went on a little bit of a rant there. I don't want this discussion about putting vocabulary into your child's environment to increase anyone's guilt or anxiety about what is and isn't in their power and they're in control. What's in your control? The input that your child is hearing. What your child's output is in their control. Okay. Back to talking about vocabulary in play. Something else I really want to stress when I'm talking about modeling vocabulary in play is that I do not do this all the time, because child-led independent play is really important for kids. They need freedom to play without adult input. So when I model vocabulary during play, I'm doing it for really short bursts, maybe 10 minutes at a time, and only if my child actually wants me to join in. If they're happily playing by themselves, I leave them to it. My daughter is not, the most independent player in the world, and we're working on increasing that, giving her more opportunities for it. So when she is playing independently, I do not interrupt. I use that opportunity to go and try and have a hot cup of tea or clean the kitchen or, just sit on the couch and stare into space doing nothing. I'm talking about doing this occasionally as a way of connecting with your child, enriching their language environment. This is not about constant teaching. So, real life examples of what I do with my children. So, if I had recently read a book with the word collapse in it, and my child built a tower that fell over, I might use that opportunity to say, oh no, it collapsed. It fell down. So I'm weaving that basic child definition into my sentences without saying, here's the definition of the word. I might just say the same sentence twice, once with the tier 2 word and then once with my tier 1 explanation. It collapsed. It fell down. If I were modeling a word like gloomy from a book that I'd read the day before, and then we woke up the next morning and the sky was dark and overcast, I might say, oh, it's a gloomy sky today. It's dark and grey and it's a little bit miserable and sad. It's gloomy. So they're really tiny natural moments, but they all add up. Doing all of the things that we spoke about last episode with targeting vocabulary in books is such a really nice way of drawing your attention to what might be some focus words for that particular week. And one last point with this is that I never force my child to stop and pay attention to what I'm saying. If I say it and they don't engage, that's fine. The exposure still counts. A lot of times children don't stop and look at you when you're talking, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're not listening. And forcing your child to stop and look at you and break up the play is not going to increase their enjoyment, and it's not going to have them engaged in what you're saying. Just hearing the word, and you put it out there in the world, and if your child hears it, they hear it, and if they're so focused that they're not hearing it, that's not a problem. So we don't want this to feel like a lesson. We want this to feel like natural play. And I guess that's the really key thing, is that when you're targeting, especially those tier 2 words, make it as natural as you can. And that's where the practice comes in. So if you practice doing this with book reading, where it's natural for those tier 2 words to come up, then you're actually making it more natural for you to use those tier 2 words while you're talking to your child. And it's more natural for you to be giving child-friendly definitions because you practiced with the book reading. And one step before that, it's why we start with those flashcards, because sitting there and identifying tier 2 words is hard. So if you've got flashcards to do it for you and you've got pre-prepared child-friendly definitions, you're practicing. And then it's easier to bring it into your natural conversation. If you are having trouble with any of this, I do have the free Robust Vocabulary Instruction Pack on my Teachers Pay Teachers store that steps through the process and has some example flashcards and example definitions that you can use. I'm always happy if you DM me on my Instagram at Not Just Theories to help explain further, or if you have a particular book, I'm happy to help you come up with some Tier 2 vocabulary and some definitions for that book, because I think this is something that is a really helpful way for you to elevate your child's language. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now because I've been talking for a bit longer than I intended. But to wrap up, play is a natural extension for vocabulary learning beyond those books that we talked about already. Sometimes I will set up invitations to play that link to the words we've been reading, but I'll never spend more than 2 minutes doing that, because for me it's disappointing if my child then doesn't have any interest in it. I will always follow my child's lead. I will never force them to do the activity that I prepared. I try really hard not to take over and play. When I'm playing with them, I join in and I use the vocabulary myself rather than taking on that sitting back narrating role. And I do not at any point expect my child to repeat the words or the definitions. I trust that with enough meaningful exposure, those words will stick. If they are not sticking, that's the time to be thinking, okay, should I be seeing a speech pathologist maybe for an assessment of where my child's at? Is there something else that my child needs other than just, repetition and meaningful exposure? Speech pathologists can work with children with a huge variety of presentations and different needs, and some of what I've talked about today just might not be appropriate for your particular child and where they're at. Alongside all of this, teaching, narrating, vocabulary and play discussion, I don't want to take away from the fact that it is still important to give your child plenty of time for independent play and self-learning rather than focusing on vocabulary. This is just something to sprinkle in for a few minutes a day rather than have it be something you do all the time. This brings us to the end of our little 3-part mini-series on robust vocabulary instruction. So hopefully you understand now what robust vocabulary is, that Tier 2 meaningful exposure, how to highlight vocabulary in books, and now a little bit about how you might carry it into your play. My hope is that these episodes give you some really practical, realistic ways to grow your child's language without worksheets, without drills, and without pressure. If you've enjoyed this series, I would love if you could share it with another parent, carer, or even an educator who might find it helpful. And if you haven't already, make sure you're following Not Just Theories so you don't miss our future episodes. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Thanks so much for listening to Not Just Theories. I really appreciate you being here. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave us a rating or review, or just share this episode with someone else who you think might find it comforting or useful. I hope to see you back here soon.